coronavirus has been announced by the Prime Minister. As of now, people must stay at home except for shopping, basic necessities, daily exercise, medical care or need. One Kiwi in the UK, musician Bridget Walsh, has been helping other Kiwis there get financial aid, and I spoke to her recently. Bridget, what's happening there?
I mean, look, I can tell you what's happening in my flat and the surrounding streets, because I haven't really been anywhere else since maybe Tuesday, I think. In fact, actually, no, since the weekend, I haven't been anywhere beyond about a 5-minute walk from my house. But look, I don't want to go anywhere near central London. Obviously, we shouldn't be going anywhere now. All the public transport is basically closed, and I think everybody who can be at home is pretty well aware that that's where they should be. So I've just kind of, I've put in an order for a veg box to arrive this week, and I'm walking my dog at the park, drinking lots of green smoothies, and FaceTiming everybody, basically.
Nice. So you've been helping other New Zealanders there get access to financial aid as a self-employed person. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so I'm a musician, obviously, and I've been based out of the UK for, 10 years now. And I was actually supposed to be coming home to Aotearoa on Tuesday with my band on tour. So I didn't even have any work lined up here for the next kind of 6 weeks or so, because we were coming down there to play shows. So as soon as we found out on Saturday that wasn't happening, obviously sheer terror took over as a self-employed person. And straight away I just started to look on the kind of websites to see what options were available. And I think it was Sunday I started my universal credit application, which is, I've never done anything with the benefit system here before, so I didn't really know what I was doing, but I was just kind of following all these links and looking through and trying to digest all the information and work out what the options were. And then, I had finished my application, I think, on the Tuesday. I'd taken my time with it, and then was told that they were going to, they wanted me to come in for an appointment. And I was like, well, no, I'm not doing that. Not going in for an appointment. Are you crazy? No one should be coming in for an appointment. And I think at that point, it was like an automated response, the system was just going through the motions of, oh, so you'd like a benefit. This is the process you have to go through. But I sort of held my ground, and I was like, actually, and this is all through their online messaging system, I was like, actually, I think that I won't come in for an appointment. Thanks very much. Could we please just do this over the telephone? Right. And you can let me know what email address I need to send my stuff to. So anyway, I kind of held my ground on it and got through, and then made this post on Facebook as soon as I'd done it, kind of itemizing to self-employed people, don't freak out. I think this is going to work. I'll keep you posted, basically. And I posted screen grabs of what I had done, and I was like, get all your stuff together, and you might be able to do this too. I'll let you know if it works.
That is Bridget Walsh from the UK there, where strict new curbs on life in the UK to tackle the spread have been announced by the Prime Minister. Thank you very much for your questions. Thank you so much. I'm back on the day after, because Checkpoint Special is tomorrow and it's coming up. Thank you for your time. I'm Wallace Chapman. Till later.
Ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. E haere aki nei, banks move to save homes with 6-month mortgage holidays for people with incomes affected by coronavirus. And the government unveils a $6 billion plus loan guarantee scheme for businesses. We talk to the Finance Minister live. As we head to lockdown, what's an essential service, what will stay open and what won't? We will have the details. Together, the probable and positive cases of COVID-19 in New Zealand tally 155 so far. But some good news, 12 of those people have recovered, and of the 6 in hospital, none are in ICU. And the race to get home and away, we hear from New Zealanders stranded overseas and tourists stuck here.
RNZ News at 5. Kia ora ko Susana Leata tēnei. Banks have agreed to mortgage holidays and a business loan scheme to help households and companies ride out the COVID-19 crisis. As the deadline for a national looms, any New Zealanders overseas are now being warned it will practically be very difficult, if not impossible, to get home. Here's our political editor, Jane Patterson.
The government has made the next move to help households and businesses weather the storm. 6-month mortgage holidays will be available to those hit financially by COVID-19, with banks to release more specific criteria in the coming days. The Finance Minister Grant Robertson says there will also be a $6.5 billion finance guarantee scheme for small and medium-sized businesses.
The scheme will include a limit of $500,000 per loan and would apply to firms with a turnover of between $250,000 and $80 million per annum.
The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says New Zealanders overseas can no longer rely on government-arranged mercy flights, as crucial transit points in other countries have now closed. Tens of thousands of New Zealanders are being encouraged to consider sheltering where they are now. Ms Ardern says the window for making it back has pretty much closed.
Air New Zealand has been our link to try and bring New Zealanders home, but we are being very open and honest. Regardless of that ability via flights, actually those transit routes have stopped.
Jacinda Ardern says any New Zealander arriving from overseas poses a serious risk and will be treated as such. She urges people trying to travel home domestically to remain calm, saying arrangements will be made, including possible flights or other transport past the lockdown deadline. Ms Ardern says 12 people with COVID-19 have now fully recovered. 6 are still recovering in hospital, but none have needed high dependency unit or ICU care. From Parliament, Jane Patterson.
Many New Zealanders trying to get home from overseas have been turned away at the airport. Kiwi Lucia Afanasi says she was told 10 minutes before check-in her flight home from London, stopping over in Dubai, was only available to UAE residents.
At the airport, there were people crying, there were families, a grown man sobbing in the corner, elderly couples who were trying to get back, Australians as well as Kiwis.
Lucia Afanasi. The country's largest business organisation says businesses will open their doors on Thursday if it isn't made clearer what an essential service is. Retail giants, hardware stores and manufacturers are all desperately seeking clarification if they can stay open after the lockdown period begins. The warehouse was confident it could keep its doors open, but the government said this afternoon that decision hadn't been made yet. The Employment and Manufacturers Association's Alan McDonald says they are receiving more than 250 calls a day.
Too many people don't know what an essential business is, and they are going to make the decision for themselves. These are people who have built up businesses over years, and the prospect of seeing that disappear or struggle, they're sort of going, well, I'm going to open.
Alan McDonald. An 0800 number for businesses to ask if they are considered essential or not will be available from 5 p.m. today. Parents who are also essential workers can get a caregiver buddy during the lockdown. The Ministry of Education says the ideal isolation during the COVID Level 4 alert is to limit connections to immediate family. The Secretary for Education, Iona Holstead, says that won't be possible for essential workers. She says they will have the option to extend their isolation group to include someone who can act as a caregiver.
In the case, for example, of a child of an essential worker who cannot stay home and they need to have a child cared for, if they identify a trusted buddy, as long as they're not elderly or vulnerable in other ways, and if that person is identified as part of your self-isolated group, they become the child's caregiver.
Iona Holstein says it's critical the caregiver has no other contacts other than their own household. The local share market has clawed its way back from a weak start to the day to end up 7.2%. The benchmark top 50 index was down about 1% in early trading, but has since rallied sharply with broad-based buying for stocks that have been battered over the past 2 weeks. There's been strong price rises for tourism-related stocks and retirement village operators. The warehouse's share price also rose by more than a third before it was placed in a trading halt amid confusion about whether or not it will be able to carry on trading through the COVID-19 lockdown. It's coming up to 5 minutes past 5. The New Zealand Olympic fraternity is supporting a postponement of this year's Games in Tokyo, while the International Olympic Committee member Dick Pound has told USA Today a decision had already been made. The postponement of the Games, which had been due to start on July 24th because of the coronavirus pandemic, is still officially being considered by the IOC. The NZOC, New Zealand Athletes, Paralympics New Zealand and High Performance Sport New Zealand say they're backing a postponement of the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games. The announcement comes after New Zealand athletes were surveyed for their views on the future of both events. The Olympic committees of the USA, Canada, Australia and Switzerland are among the countries who have already called for a postponement. Meanwhile, the last of the major sports in our region has fallen to the coronavirus pandemic, with Football's A-League being halted immediately. Last week, the Wellington Phoenix decided to base themselves in Australia, but the New Zealand members of the squad will now return home before the border shuts tomorrow night. That's the news.
This is the latest public health message from the Ministry of Health. The government has announced that effective immediately, New Zealand will be moving to level 3 on the COVID-19 alert system. Physical distancing of 2 metres should be observed when you are outside of your home. The public will continue to have access to essential services such as supermarkets, hospitals and pharmacies when we move to level 4. All educational facilities and early childhood education ECE centres will close, except for a small provision for the children of essential workers. Restrictions will be put in place for travel between regions, apart from people returning to their home or accessing essential services. Additional border measures will be imposed for returning New Zealanders, including the requirement to self-isolate in the city you arrive in. For further information, please visit covid19.govt.nz.
Now, the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, including Coromandel, Waikato, Waitomo and Taumaranui. A few showers easing tomorrow. Bay of Plenty, Taupo, Taihape, Whanganui and Manawatu. Fine apart from isolated afternoon and evening showers. Horowhenua to Wellington, also Gisborne through to Wairarapa. Fine apart from isolated showers in Gisborne and Hawke's Bay until tonight. Bulla and Westland, cloudy periods and isolated showers. Nelson, Marlborough, Canterbury and North Otago mainly fine, but showers about the western ranges of Nelson and Banks Peninsula today. For the remainder of Otago, Southland and Fiordland, showers mainly in the south, easing tonight and clearing Otago and inland Southland. Chatham Islands, fine spells, a period of rain tonight and tomorrow morning. RNZ National. It's coming up to 8 minutes past 5.
Thanks, Susanna, and this is Checkpoint. I'm Lisa Owen. The government's brokered a deal with banks in a bid to keep roofs over homeowners' heads. There will be 6-month mortgage holidays for people whose incomes have been savaged by COVID-19. The banks and government also unveiled a $6.25 billion safety net for small to medium businesses, basically a credit line aimed at protecting jobs and keeping business doors open long term. Loans will be capped at $500,000 over 3 years and interest will apply. The government will also shoulder 80% of the credit risk. Joining me now is Finance Minister Grant Robertson. Good evening, Minister.
Good evening, Lisa.
I know there's a lot to still be finalised here, but in terms of the mortgage holidays, what are your expectations around what that will mean in practical terms?
Yeah, well, obviously it's up to each bank to determine the precise details, but what we've been able to agree with them is that they will be offering 6-month holidays. That is for both principal and interest. And, that's really important because as people have been either losing their jobs, going down to reduced hours, having reduced incomes, there's a lot of pressure around those mortgage payments. This allows those mortgage holders who have been affected to be able to access that holiday. I do ask this, and I'll get this in early, that we've worked really hard with the banks on this over the last few days, and I thank them for their work. They are now having to get the systems set up, and so those detailed arrangements for each individual bank will be out within days. Please if you're a mortgage holder, don't bombard your bank. Wait to see when they come out with the details and then contact them then. But we thought it was really important to get that out now because I know it's been a subject of a lot of stress for people.
When you say you've done a lot of work on this over the past few days, did they take some convincing? And were you asking for longer than 6 months in terms of the holiday?
No, we weren't, and this is based on the Australian scheme, which is a 6-month one as well. It was more a matter of talking through with the banks both this and the business financing guarantee scheme, just to make sure that everybody could do it. Quite clearly, Lisa, we've had competition law and so on in New Zealand that means that banks don't generally collaborate together on things like this. So there have been, some rules and regs to work our way through. Each bank has obviously got slightly different ways that it goes about mortgage lending, and so we just had to work our way through all of that and also the details of that business finance guarantee scheme. But I really do want to thank the banks for their cooperation. The Reserve Bank have also been part of these discussions, and they've moved to make it easier in terms of what the banks are required to do and their core funding ratios in terms of when they give loans out. So it's been a really collaborative effort.
Okay, let's move on to the $6.25 billion finance guarantee scheme. Now, this is for small to medium businesses. You're taking on 80% of the credit risk. Why so high here? What were you aiming to do?
Well, essentially, we're aiming to make sure that the money gets out the door and it gets to the businesses that need it. What we're talking about here are businesses that are solvent, businesses that have been viable up until this point, but are facing, significant headwinds. We want those businesses and the workers who are within them to make sure that they can keep their jobs and keep their incomes. This is a way of, as you said it yourself in the introductory comments, of effectively opening up a line of credit for that. The risk we had by putting too much risk on the banks themselves is that they would apply perhaps more traditional lending criteria. We want to make sure we open that up a bit, share a greater degree of the risk on the Crown's balance sheet, which is obviously very strong, and make sure, therefore, that the loans are approved. Businesses still have to be, functioning businesses, and there'll still be processes to go through to get the loans, but taking on a greater share of risk for the Crown just means more people will benefit and more jobs will be saved.
So basically you're saying, without being flippant about it, you're saying that you were encouraging, by taking this level of risk on to the government, you're encouraging the banks to give people a bigger crack than they would normally.
Absolutely, that's the point. And look, banks, we can all on another day and another time have our thoughts about the way that banks have, profits they make and all of those sorts of things. But ultimately, they are businesses. They make these business decisions. This is giving them more confidence to lend, not to lend in a silly way, but
but you're encouraging them to push the boat out, aren't you, a little bit?
Yes, absolutely, because these are extraordinary times, and good businesses that employ lots of people, that pay the wages of people and their families, look after their families, they could be losing their jobs if we apply too strict, too traditional rule-based approach to this. This gives confidence to the banks, confidence to those people who are going to be applying for the loan.
You are spending up a storm here, aren't you? I mean, you've extended the wage subsidy package by an extra, $4 billion. You're backing the $6.25 billion in loans. You put up $12.1 billion with the business package. How long and how large can you go here?
Yeah, you're not wrong, Lisa, but if you look around the world, you'll see that this is what governments everywhere are doing. This is the rainy day, and the really important thing for New Zealanders to remember is that we came into this with 19.5% debt to GDP ratio. That's one of the lowest in the developed world. That means we've got room on our balance sheet to be able to do this. Now, of course, it's not limitless, and we are entering into a period of great uncertainty, but we're making these decisions so that we can support New Zealanders' livelihoods, support them to stay in their homes, support them to put food on the table, to have jobs that give them wages, and I'll always prioritise that, Lisa, and we've been very careful over the last couple of years. That's meant that we're in this position now to be able to do this. And yes, we're stretching out that balance sheet, but we're doing it for the good of New Zealanders.
I want to talk about wage earners. So, just to be clear, those people who haven't explicitly been told by their employer, the business that they work for, that business has gone under and will no longer be operating, should those wage earners expect to be paid over the next 4 weeks?
Well, yes, they should be, of course, and businesses will continue to operate. And I really want to stress what I said yesterday. This is really time for employers and employees to talk to each other about what the plan is here. The reason for opening the wage subsidy scheme up to everybody is to exactly do that, give people confidence about that. And look, yesterday I heard of a business where yesterday morning they had said to the 40 staff, we're going to have to let you go. We came through with that extended wage subsidy scheme, and the boss was back on the phone to the workers saying, hang on, come back, we're going to work this through, we think we can make this work. And what we're seeing is businesses looking at that and saying, because we're paying that wage subsidy in a lump sum, they can then use that to spread costs across their business and keep workers employed. And so I really just urge people who are concerned about that, have a chat with the business, chat with your employer and say, where are we at on this? Because, we do have to all be in this together. It's a very stressful time for workers and businesses alike.
I want to get through a couple of things quickly because we're running out of time. In terms of that subsidies package, basically you get kept on at 80% of your pay, right?
Best endeavours to do that, yes.
Yeah. So you're basically, the expectation is that the workers will take a 20% haircut on their wages.
Well, we hope not, but if that's what's necessary to keep people employed, then that's what the scheme's for. I mean, just be clear, it's a subsidy scheme. It's designed to support employers to be able to keep people employed, and we've said that needs to be at least 80%. We put that in place because we thought that was a way of maintaining that attachment between employers and employees.
How many have taken it up, and to what value so far?
I knew you would ask me that, and I don't know if I've got those numbers right. Oh, hang on. Here we are. I'm sorry about that. As of this morning, there were 117,273 applications made for wage subsidies. They're being worked through, and so we've had 41,505 approved in the week since it's been open, with around $687 million paid out so far, but obviously a lot more to come.
Appreciate your time, Minister. That is the Finance Minister, Grant Robertson. And joining us now is our political editor, Jane Patterson. Jane, what is the government doing about getting these stranded Kiwis home now?
Well, of course, you've just been talking to Grant Robertson about the coming months and how people will financially get through this. But right now, there are a lot of people with very urgent needs as that deadline looms in just over 24 hours now at midnight on Wednesday. A lot of people, it is transport. If they're not at home and if they're not in a place where they can self-isolate, it's becoming very difficult. And there are two different types of people we're dealing with. The first is overseas, people who are travelling overseas in particular. Now, the government today has basically said that with key transit routes closing down in Asia, for example, Singapore, it's becoming really difficult, even through government-sponsored flights with Air New Zealand, to actually get those flights from a lot of countries back to New Zealand. So people still overseas are effectively being told that window has pretty much closed, and to find shelter, to hunker down in the meantime until things return to normal, whenever that will be. Now, the second group is people who might be stuck in the South Island, trying to get back home to the North Island, for example, and really struggling to get a flight or any kind of transport with the rush with everybody else. So the Prime Minister said today, please stay calm. We will make sure that people will get home, and that may mean that there are some extra flights or extra transport past that deadline, that lockdown deadline, but that's not going to be widespread and open. It will be for very specific cases.
Yeah, she used the words exercising common sense, didn't she, that the government would do that?
That's right. So, look, we had a woman this morning very concerned about her daughter in Dunedin, up all night trying to get her on an Air New Zealand flight, but they were just absolutely jam-packed. So Ms Ardern saying in that situation there will be flights available. They just have to work through the details, and they just encourage people to keep working and contacting those companies, those transport companies. But the government, certainly from its side, won't be imposing that strict deadline for people who still do need to get around New Zealand.
In terms of coming back into the country, the Prime Minister reiterated again several times today that the people who are the greatest risk to us all are the people who are returning from overseas. And she seemed to be indicating that the government is working on something around that. So what are we expecting? Are we expecting mass quarantines at the site of arrival, or what?
I think that's absolutely the direction that they are heading in, and Ms Ardern was pretty blunt when asked the risk posed, of course, by anyone who is still overseas and arriving back from both our experience and the experience of other countries. So at the moment it sounds like they're really trying to figure out exactly how many people are in that category who might be actively trying to come home. People register with MFAT, but not everyone is on that list. So they're just trying to get a sense of the numbers, but I very much took the tone that people arriving back would not just be encouraged to self-isolate. Of course, they're returning into a very, very different situation as well. It sounded more like there would be a managed, monitored quarantine for anyone coming back. So no specific details, but very much the message was if you are arriving back in the country in the next 24 hours, expect a pretty strict set of rules for you when you do arrive.
These are very unusual political times, Jane, so we're hearing a lot from government ministers about what's going on. Where is the opposition on all of this? What is Simon Bridges saying?
So today the Business Committee, which is basically the senior MPs from the different parties, have agreed to set up a committee that will be chaired by Simon Bridges as the opposition leader. Furthermore, it will have a majority of opposition MPs sitting on that committee with representatives from other parties. Now, this is basically a measure to ensure scrutiny of the government's actions, of course, across so many portfolios, but economic and health primarily. Through the adjournment of Parliament, Parliament comes back tomorrow to issue a epidemic notice, to invoke a state of emergency and also to pass crucial legislation. After that, it's adjourned for at least 5 weeks and potentially longer. So Simon Bridges talking today saying the accountability is very, very important even when we're in this white hot situation. The government needs to have that scrutiny. Now, he has said that he will be constructive. He said this is not about playing politics or creating needless controversy. He said it will be a very constructive process, but basically that committee will have the powers of the Privileges Committee, which means that they can effectively order people to come and present to them, and that might be government ministers, it might be public health officials, it could be banks, it could be any companies or agencies that have a major role to play in this. So those meetings will start next week. Simon Bridges intends to stay in Wellington and be physically present at those committee meetings, depending on other people's circumstances, whether there'll be other MPs or other people there submitting to them in person, will all have to be sorted out.
Thank you, Jane. That is our political editor, Jane Patterson, joining us live from Parliament. It is 22 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Keen for your feedback on anything you've heard on the programme this evening. Will you be asking for a mortgage holiday? And what about the loans for small businesses? Will that help you out? You can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or you can send us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. There is still much confusion tonight over whether stores like the Warehouse will remain open over the 4-week lockdown period. Retail giants, hardware stores and manufacturers are all desperately seeking clarification over whether they are considered essential services. The Warehouse said this morning it would be keeping its doors open, but the government says this might not be the case, leaving businesses in the dark with just over 24 hours to go until the lockdown period begins. Mediana Johnson reports.
The Warehouse was confident it could keep its doors open, but was cut down by the government hours later. The Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, Deputy Chief Executive Paul Stokes, says it isn't up to them.
The government has not decided that the Warehouse will be open. We are working through those firms that will be required or allowed to remain open. I would caution firms from leaping to judgments about what their status will be before they have received an adjudication from the government.
The Warehouse Group said in a statement this afternoon it is in discussion with the government about what items within its stores will remain available. The retailer, Briscoe Groups, is sticking with its planned shutdown of Rebel Sport and its homeware stores, as they say they are more concerned about staff wellbeing than sales.
We were not given any indication by anyone that if we chose to sell hand sanitizer and toilet paper, we'd be allowed to open. So that indication was not given to us. And look, at the end of the day, I think I'm a bit more interested in the safety and well-being of my staff rather than a few sales of some toilet rolls.
But First Union organiser Robin Wilson-Whitting says allowing large retailers to remain open to sell grocery items and pet food would help supermarket staff.
Our position is that having that sort of product available to customers in these circumstances could be beneficial as long as it's contained, and those are the only items that are available from a health and safety point of view. That would release the pressure that we're seeing on our members in the supermarket.
Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment Deputy Chief Executive Paul Stokes says essential services will be limited.
The purpose of the essential services list is not to ensure that life goes on unchanged, it's to ensure that we are able as a nation to self-isolate and eradicate and eliminate COVID-19. The purpose is to ensure that we provide for the necessities of life, for health, for safety, for welfare and for essential infrastructure.
But this definition has still left hundreds of businesses in the dark. The Employment and Manufacturers Association, the largest business member organisation in the country, has been inundated with calls from its members. Its head of advocacy and strategy, Alan McDonald, says it is receiving 500 calls a day from businesses, and half of those are from companies who want to know if they can stay open.
So the message from the Prime Minister is we don't want businesses open unless they're essential. But too many people don't know what an essential business is, and they are going to make the decision for themselves. These are people who have built up businesses over years, and the prospect of seeing that disappear or struggle, they're sort of going, well, I'm going to open.
Meanwhile, Bunnings were unable to comment on whether their doors would be open come Thursday morning. An 0800 number for businesses to ask if they are considered essential or not will be made available from 5 p.m. today. Mo te hōtaka o te ahiahi, ko Miriana Johnson tēnei.
Now, in breaking news, the deadline for people needing to travel on domestic flights, trains and the Cook Strait ferries to get home has been extended until midnight on Friday. But we must reiterate, the country will still go into lockdown at 11:59 tomorrow night. If you are at home, you are supposed to stay home. The exemption is only for people travelling from other parts of the country to their home. Lockdown will go ahead Wednesday night, 11:59 p.m. It's been a chaotic day in parts of Auckland as people scramble to prepare for tomorrow's 4-week lockdown. Queues of people getting tested for COVID, along with queues of people doing some last-minute shopping, made for busy streets and stressed drivers. Come Thursday, those streets and stores will be much quieter, and people were making the most of their final outings. Our cameraman, Nick Munro, and reporter Nita Blake-Person hopped in the car to check out the situation. And just a note, all their interviews were conducted from at least 2 metres away.
Busy roads and yet more shopping. Today, though, it's been more about keeping busy over the next few weeks rather than keeping a full pantry. At this fitness centre, there were lines out the door with people looking to set up at-home exercise routines. Spending at food and liquor stores topped $111 million yesterday, up 157% on the same time last year. While supermarkets appeared calmer today, some people had turned to other outlets to stock up. There were queues at least 2 Auckland gun stores, with shoppers reporting shelves stripped of air rifles.
There's something a little bit not quite right. Yeah, it's not as it should be, definitely not. No, it's sending out the wrong messages.
The owner of Gun City, David Tipple, says business has been up in recent weeks, with people buying guns for pest control during the lockdown period.
I would say it's probably 20% more than what we would expect at this time, but it started some time ago. It wasn't just in the last day or two. I think the minute the lockdown was a real possibility, then people started to prepare for a lockdown.
Today's queues weren't just about shopping, though. Community testing stations also generating large turnouts, but in much safer spaces. This community testing centre at St Luke's in Auckland is being absolutely inundated with people getting tested for COVID-19. The cars are backed up about 500 metres with people who are waiting to be tested. They must get tested in their cars, and they're not even allowed to drive onto the car park without getting the green light. The staff here are all wearing full personal protective equipment, including gloves, gowns and face masks. And there's also security here to make sure things go smoothly. While queues for COVID testing are likely to continue for the coming days, roads and shops will be getting much quieter. Until then, this queue at McDonald's was full of people with one thing on their mind as they prepare to go home and stay home.
I was lying in bed last night and just kind of realised that I'm not going to be able to get anything, so I thought might as well come and get a Big Mac.
It's the last day, so we're going to make the most of it.
In Auckland for Checkpoint, Nita Blakeperson.
And it's been a hectic day in the capital too, with people flocking to supermarkets, banks, warrant of fitness providers, McDonald's drive-thrus and petrol stations. Hundreds of Victoria University students are also trying to leave Wellington, with those who can't being moved into one residence to self-isolate over the coming 4 weeks. Our reporter Logan Church is on Lambton Quay and joins us now. Logan, you've been out and about in the city. What have you seen today?
Hi Lisa, it's certainly been an odd day out here in the capital. On one hand, many areas which would usually be pumping with people are completely quiet. I had a walk along the waterfront earlier today down behind Te Papa, and there was barely anyone there other than the odd security guard. And where we are on Lambton Quay at this time of night, there would usually be thousands of people making their way home. Now barely a trickle of people coming out. However, there has been some hotspots among those, as you mentioned, supermarkets. Some supermarkets, including the Countdown behind me, have introduced strict restrictions on numbers of people coming into the shop, and that's resulted in large queues. In one supermarket, I saw a queue of people from outside the front door, down in front of the building, onto the footpath and down onto the road in front of it. And outside of the city, I have heard reports from people who have told me that some arguments have broken out, mainly over that social distancing rule, staying 2 metres away from other people. Some people are stressed, and there's certainly a lot of tension, but as of this stage, most people still sticking to those rules as we look ahead to 4 weeks of staying at home.
And obviously you're a university city, so what about those students, and especially the ones who may not be able to get home?
Well, many of the students at the Victoria University of Wellington, of course, don't come from Wellington, and they stay at some of the halls of residences. There are many of them in Wellington, and they got told yesterday that they, if possible, would have to go home, and that as of Wednesday, their contracts with the university for accommodation would be suspended. Now, of course, not everyone can get home. There simply aren't enough flights available between now and the start of the lockdown tomorrow. So those students have been told to go to Warehouse, which is one of the halls of residence here. And we expect up to 300 people will have to spend the 4 weeks in self-isolation there while they wait for things to slowly return to normal.
Thank you for that, Logan. That's Logan Church joining us live from Wellington. Coming up on Checkpoint on RNZ National, the race to get home and away. New Zealanders stranded overseas and tourists trapped here share their stories. Economist Shamabel Jacob joins us live, and the UK joins New Zealand in lockdown. We would love to hear from you. Checkpoint will stay on air as an essential service throughout the lockdown. What are your plans? How are you using your last hours of freedom? And what priorities are you making for yourself? Text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Let's get to the headlines now with Susanna.
The deadline for people needing to travel on domestic flights, trains and Cook Strait ferries to get home before the country moves into lockdown has been extended until midnight on Friday. People have been flocking to the Picton Ferry Terminal today trying to get to their destination. Police had to direct traffic and tell those who didn't have tickets to leave. The warehouse is unlikely to remain open as an essential service after previously saying it was a provider of key consumer goods. A number of retailers have been seeking clarification as to whether they can trade during the lockdown. The Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, says retailers outside of supermarkets are unlikely to remain open. She says essential services are things that provide the necessities of life. Mortgage holders whose jobs have been impacted by the COVID-19 outbreak will be able to get a 6-month payment holiday. It's part of 2 further support schemes announced by the government today. The opposition leader Simon Bridges will chair a cross-party committee to scrutinise the government's response to COVID-19. Parliament had technically been in recess this week, but MPs will be recalled tomorrow afternoon to put the country into a state of emergency and establish the lockdown. To ensure the government is still held to account during the adjournment, a special select committee chaired by the opposition leader Simon Bridges will be formed to interrogate the government on its epidemic response. A North Canterbury drought support group fears already stressed farmers will struggle during the lockdown. The entire North Island, parts of the South Island and the Chatham Islands are still in drought. Winton Daly from the Hurunui Adverse Events Committee says during the dry spell farmers have been encouraged to talk to each other, but self-isolation could be a problem. Those are the latest news headlines from RNZ National. Our next news and weather update is at 6.
Thanks, Susanna. This is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. It's time for the business news now with Nona Peltier, who joins me in the studio. Heard about Warehouse there in the news, Nona. Not so sure whether they're essential or non-essential, but they're in a trading halt. Is it all related? What's the story?
Yeah, well, they put out an announcement earlier this morning, and it was just like a market update, not one that was considered or marked as price sensitive, but it surely was, because when the market opened, just 4 minutes before, in fact, the market opened, they had to reissue the same statement, but this time with a price warning, that it was, hey, read this.
So what did they say, so people know? What did they say in that
Well, they
notice to the
basically
market?
said that they were an essential service. They talked about their brands. They said they would remain open for New Zealanders through the period, the 4-week period, and yada, yada, and a whole long page of the things that they were going to do.
And so at a time where everyone else is being forced to shut their doors, the Warehouse puts out a notice saying we're open for business.
Yes, and not only that, our online business too. Now, this is amid a flurry of activity, if you could imagine, all sorts of companies updating the market on how these closures are going to affect them. So, it's a big announcement that's moving in the opposite direction of what others were seeing.
What effects did it have?
Well, the share price rose 45% and was about 35% up when they finally called the trading halt where it sat. Now, the company is still not backing down 100%. They're saying they're in discussions with the government. They're going to update the market,
But in discussions
shortly.
is a very big gap between in discussions and we are confirmed as an essential service.
Well, all will be revealed by the morning, I assume. Yes.
So,
yeah, but it wasn't just them, We had a lot of other announcements. Michael Hill, for example, is closing all of its stores, but said that its online business would continue to trade. One wonders how that's possible. I asked Rod Duke from Briscoe Group what he thought of all of it, because they announced that they were going to close for 4 weeks. He said, yeah, absolutely. We're also closing our online business, and that's how it's going to be. I said, well, Michael Hill's open. He goes, well, that's maybe because they have a different system than we do. We stock our online sales from our stores, which meant our
staff
stores
need to be there to pack it up and
he said, I care more about my staff than I do about, selling a roll of toilet paper.
So again, a bunch of uncertainty there.
Yep.
And what else has that led to on the markets?
Well, there's been a lot of other things that happened today. One of the things I really want to draw attention to is Ryman Healthcare that came out and said it was cancelling all the construction of its development projects in New Zealand. And it has a considerable number of them, including some development projects in Victoria. Now, in Victoria, they're monitoring the situation. But here in New Zealand, they're closing it all up. And so they have 12 developments in all. And I asked for a comment, and they said, hey, thanks very much for the offer, but we're really busy looking after 3,000 people in care and another 8,000 residents. So we don't have time to talk to you. We also got an update from Precinct Properties that said Commercial Bay development at the bottom of Queen Street is like a $874 million development next to City Rail.
The CRL.
Yeah, that's right. That's closed down as well. They're scaling it all down, and that building will not be completed until this crisis is over, which made raise the question of what happens to City Rail. And then, boom, we got another announcement saying that's all cancelled. We wanted to talk to Fletcher Building, but they weren't available today. Hopefully, maybe tomorrow. They were really busy, and one might wonder what happens to the International Convention Centre. Because that
all non-essential construction, we've been told, is on hold.
The only yes, and we heard from other industry sectors that said, hey, we it's all bets are off. We're closing down our operations because we can't function.
Can we get the final numbers?
Now, this is going to really surprise you. With all of that, you might think that the market would be down. But you would be wrong, Lisa. We ended up 7.2%, nearly erasing yesterday's 7.6% fall. We rose 610 points to 9,109, which is about where we were last week. The Kiwi was also strong, 57.9 US cents. That's about a gain of about 1.5 cents, something like that. 98.1 Australian, which is pretty steady, and a little bit stronger against the British pence at 49.7. And so there was a lot of strength in the market right across tourism stocks, A2 milk, even Ryman with that news rose 23.8%. Main Freight, which is our biggest transport company there, listed 23.7% up. And Fisher & Paykel, which is one we talked about yesterday, which moved against the market and moved up, was up another 10.2%. So there is life in our market. Don't despair.
Thanks, Nona. That is Nona Peltier with our business news. The government today agreed to 6-month mortgage holidays and another $6.25 billion for a finance guarantee scheme for small and medium-sized businesses. So where did the money come from and how long will it last? Well, joining us now from self-isolation via Skype is economist Shamabeel Yakov. Good evening, Shamabeel. Lovely to see you. First off, what's your reaction to the two big announcements from the Finance Minister today? One, that the banks are going to offer mortgage holidays, and also this, well, it's a kind of underwrite scheme for small to medium businesses.
Yeah, we expected those to happen because we had seen similar moves in Australia already. So we're seeing quite a bit of, copying of policies around the countries around the world because we're all kind of figuring out how to deal with this. But I think the underlying sort of principle is there's a lot of economic anxiety for people, right? We've got dealing with this incredible period where nobody has a rule book in terms of how to deal with it or how to understand it. We know it's going to hurt, but we don't know how much. So all the policies that we've seen in the last couple of weeks have been around how can we reduce that impact? How can we blunt the impact of this recession that is inevitably coming to us?
So this week, the government almost doubled the wage subsidy package, and then we've got this announcement about the loan guarantee scheme. We've already had the $12.1 billion, business package. I mean, how long and large can they go with their spending?
Well, I think the first is around what happens if we don't do something. If we don't do anything, the cost and the consequence, both the human cost and the economic cost, would be enormous. So it makes more sense for us to borrow money and to invest in the economy and to try and blunt the impact as much as possible. But roughly speaking, we probably have around $60 billion worth of borrowing capacity. That's roughly what we can borrow without running into problems in raising money and all those other bits and pieces. But that's not a hard and fast rule. We're living in a period of extreme uncertainty in global financial markets. And if you look forward 1 month, 2 months, and this keeps going and the global economy is still weak, we know that we're going to have to think of some other ways of doing it. Essentially, we might have to think about the Reserve Bank printing money to buy government debt.
Just on the subject of the length of this, the 6-month mortgage holiday, do you think that's long enough?
Well, everything that we are seeing in terms of the announcements are relatively time limited because we want to make sure people don't get the wrong idea in terms of free money.
Yep.
But we will see them extended over time if the economic situation gets worse. And that's what we saw with the wage subsidy program, for example. It started with some limitations. And as we went into the lockdown, it was very clear that we had to increase the limit or get rid of the limit because otherwise there'll be so many people who would be affected by loss of income and huge amounts of anxiety during this 4 weeks of lockdown.
So people who are wage earners, can they expect to remain on normal pay for the foreseeable future, or should they be expecting pay cuts, or what is the lay of the land?
So the subsidy itself is limited in terms of it's capped at how much the rate is. And so that the rate is good enough for, especially in retail, hospitality, those kinds of industries. But for highly paid professions, it's not going to cut it. But also at the same time, these highly paid workers should have sufficient reserves to be able to deal with the impact, as well as the businesses that we're dealing with. So the wage subsidy is not going to replace all the income that we would have seen during this lockdown period, but it certainly gives a lot of cash flow because we're asking businesses to essentially not trade. And that's why the support from the lending packages, particularly for the SMEs, is so important, because we know that the SMEs are most vulnerable. They tend to operate in very small margins, and a small drop in sales can be catastrophic in terms of their business survival.
And so that's great if those small and medium-sized businesses can keep going as a result of this, keep employing people and keep paying them. But I'm wondering, with people who maybe lose their jobs or reduce their hours, they're still having the same expenses in the sense that if they're renters, they've got a freeze on rent, but they've still got to cover their rent, put food on the table, power and all the rest of it. Can we expect that pressure might be going on some of those service providers to offer cheaper rates?
Yeah, I think we're going to see quite a lot of pressure in terms of how do we deal with those people who are going to be affected by it, because people will be. And I think the first port of call should be our welfare system, and they have done this already, essentially saying that if you're an existing beneficiary, about 300,000 people, we're not going to bother you too much during this period. We're going to deal with all the new people who are going to have issues. And we do have a pretty good system in terms of things like accommodation supplements, temporary accommodation supplements, emergency grants. So there are ways that our welfare system can kick into action to deal with some of this. It's not going to be perfect, but the alternative of not shutting the country down and having the disease ripping through the country is so much worse.
In terms of the economics of this bigger picture, what's it going to mean for the economy? When I spoke to you last time around this, you were saying maybe we could expect unemployment to go from about 4% knocking up towards the high 6%, maybe 7%. What's your expectations now?
The world has changed a lot. So,
in a week,
I've been working through industry by industry to get a sense of what the downside could be. And, it's very easy to be quite pessimistic. So when I'm looking at other countries that are doing this analysis, they're saying maybe somewhere between 10 and 30%. So we're talking about very, very large numbers in terms of how quickly this economic story has changed. But I'd caution that we're in a slightly different situation than a lot of other countries in that because we're an island nation and we're able to shut off our borders, if we can deal with the virus and the infection and get it under control, we can at least resume quite a lot of our economy once that's passed. Whereas in other places like Europe, the risks of the shutdown lingering until a vaccine is there is much higher.
So that is a big range, 10 to 30% unemployment. Where would you think we might land?
Well, let's put it this way. If we lose the jobs in tourism, that in itself is enough for us to reach 10% unemployment rate. So we are talking about things that are really out of the realm of what we have dealt with before. And that's why we want to have a short, sharp shock that is really as short as possible, so that once we come out of it, we still have the businesses and still have the jobs. To give you a bit of context, today, the traffic in Auckland was down by 50%. So people are traveling less. If you look at what's happening with things like job ads, what's happening with the way that we are, how businesses are behaving, all these things have slowed very sharply. The really critical thing for us is how can we make sure that those businesses and jobs, as many of them as possible, are still there in 4 weeks' time.
Again, last time we talked, some of the banks were anticipating a shrink of 3% in growth over the first 2 or 3 quarters, I think it was. Would you like to hazard a guess of where we're headed in terms of that?
Oh, it's very hard to put numbers on this stuff, right? And the reason why it's hard is because we have no data on how the economy was tracking in the beginning of this virus and where we are now. So we're trying to get as much real-time data as possible, and we haven't yet seen a slump in terms of things like consumer spending and those bits and pieces. So, I think our base case should be that the first half of this year is going to be extremely painful. We are going to see a lot of poor, vulnerable people who are going to lose their jobs, and we are going to experience something that we haven't experienced in our living memory.
Thank you for joining us this evening. That is economist Shamabeel Yaacob. It is 12 minutes away from 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. As always, we would love to hear from you. You can text us on 2101. You can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. Let us know what preparations you're making for the lockdown. How have you spent your second to last day of freedom? The rush is on to get home before midnight on Thursday, when officially the whole country country will be in lockdown. Stranded airline passengers are trying to book last-minute flights with Air New Zealand, while ferries are booked up and at full capacity. Jonathan Mitchell has more.
Pam Corbett has been at the Bluebridge ferry terminal in Picton all day, where hundreds of people turned up wanting to cross the Cook Strait. The police showed up to direct traffic and had to urge people who didn't have tickets to stay away. Ms Corbett was there trying to arrange a sailing back to Wellington and will hopefully get on a special midnight sailing later tonight.
We feel we just actually have to, hang about and keep meandering up to the terminal, which is crowded with people all standing very close together.
She says the information has been piecemeal and the crowds aren't following the keep distance rule.
There is one woman site manager at the Bluebridge terminal. She's doing a very good job, but she's on her own. They have not got enough staff to manage the crowd.
Ferries will only be transporting freight and essential service personnel from where New Zealand goes into lockdown at 1 minute to midnight on Wednesday night. Air New Zealand is still deciding what that means for its domestic and international flight schedules. The airline says it's increasing capacity for services today and tomorrow by adding additional flights or swapping to larger planes. RNZ is aware of the airline also selling tickets for early Thursday morning and on Friday. Grace Campbell is studying in Dunedin. She's got a flight out early tomorrow morning back to Wellington. However, many of her flatmates and uni mates have to stay put.
One of my friends found one flight just randomly, we've been refreshing it all of yesterday, all night, all this morning, have been refreshing and trying to find flights, and they have to drive a few hours and rent cars to go to an airport far away to then get them home.
It's a similar dilemma for Hawke's Bay mum Rachel Utley. She's trying to get her daughter back from study in Dunedin. She's been worried sick and has struggled to get through to Air New Zealand to book flights.
I've been trying constantly. I had about 4 hours sleep last night. Just been on the Air New Zealand website. I've been trying to get her from Dunedin to anywhere in the North Island, and also from Christchurch, because she can get a ride to Christchurch, anywhere in the North Island that we could pick her up, and there's just nothing available.
Many other people are lobbying the government to help and are messaging Air New Zealand on social media using the hashtag HomeN48. Air New Zealand is expected to make further announcements about its travel plans in the coming days. For Checkpoint, call Jonathan Mitchell, TNA.
Meanwhile, mass flight cancellations and border closures in crucial transit countries are wreaking havoc on New Zealanders' travel plans trying to come home, as well as those going the other way. One woman trying to get out of London says she has spent $10,000 on flights but has yet to step foot onto a plane. The government this afternoon encouraged New Zealanders overseas to shelter in place and said there were no guarantees government-assisted flights would be possible. Harry Locke has this report.
New Zealander Lucia Afanazi made the decision to come home a week ago, at a time when the situation in London, where she lives with her husband, was escalating and international flights were getting more precarious. She initially booked onto one flight through Air New Zealand, due to leave on Wednesday. But when she found out she could no longer transit through Singapore, she chose to book another flight with Etihad, stopping over in Dubai. But turning up at Heathrow, she, along with the 300 other passengers, was told 10 minutes before check-in only UAE residents would be able to board.
At the airport, there were people crying, there were families, a grown man sobbing in the corner, elderly couples who were trying to get back, Australians as well as Kiwis.
She's now facing a lockdown in London, a city where there have been over 2,000 cases of coronavirus.
We feel now like we're stuck in London, and it doesn't seem like the government really have a plan to help people in our situation.
She says the government advice up until now was to try and get home as soon as possible.
The frustrating thing as well is that the government keeps saying, book commercial flights, but there are no commercial flights left.
That directive has now changed, the government asking those overseas to stay where they are. While Air New Zealand say they are exploring the possibility of repatriation flights with the government, Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters says there are no guarantees that will be possible. Lucia's story is one that many people around the world are finding familiar. Here in New Zealand, British holidaymakers are trying to go back the other way, heeding their government's advice to all Brits overseas to come home. Around 30 people congregated outside the British consulate in Auckland this morning. For some, like Stephen Brown from Northampton, it's a pressing matter.
We're absolutely stuck. I mean, somebody needs to give us some guidance. The next concern is that our hotel here in town has said to us that from midnight on Wednesday they cannot guarantee that we'll be able to stop in the hotel. So here we are then. Nobody will talk to us from the embassy. The hotel may well throw us out at midnight tomorrow night with suitcases. Where are we supposed to go?
Many tried their luck heading to the airport as soon as they heard the news yesterday that New Zealand was to go into lockdown. Nick, who's been travelling around the country with his partner Amy, says there wasn't any hope in getting home.
We've been pretty much abandoned by the airlines. We turned up to the airport yesterday, everyone had already been sent home, so there's no customer service, nothing. We've just literally spoken to our airline and they've just said there's no flights until the 4th of July. So we're potentially facing 3 months without getting home.
Sarah Phillips came over for a holiday at the beginning of March to visit her brother Sam, who lives and works in Wellington. She went up to the British High Commission this morning, but found a deserted building. She says the advice being given is still lagging behind.
I knew that I couldn't leave the country before I was told, by the Foreign Office to leave the country. So I knew yesterday afternoon, and then this morning, a notification from the SCO saying Brits should go home now, and that's the official advice.
The British High Commission has now set up a form where British nationals in New Zealand can register their details. The Commission says they will then send out regular information updates, including if and when any further flights become available. For Checkpoint, Harry Locke.
Restaurants are crying out for clarity on government restrictions and essential services as the deadline for the unprecedented nationwide shutdown fast approaches. Food bag delivery services are going strong as people begin staying home, and some fast food outlets are closing their doors tonight. Chen Liu reports.
The government has asked all bars, restaurants and cafes to close and for takeaway services to follow suit when the alert system moves to level 4 at midnight tomorrow. But the Chief Executive of Restaurant Association, Marisa Bidwa, has some questions.
We are just asking clarification from government. We've already been in touch with several offices for clarification on the guidelines. It does include food delivery, but there hasn't been any confirmation as to whether that includes sort of restaurants using Uber or other delivery services to keep delivering food to people.
Ms. Bidwa says the advice is that food delivery can still operate, but she's wondering who is going to prepare the food if restaurants are shut. She says their 2,300 members are seeking answers as many are waiting to find out whether they remain open or not for delivery.
We know it's a difficult time for everyone, but people still need to eat, and we think that our industry can contribute to assisting feed our communities, our local communities, our essential service staff, and really sort of be a part of assisting everyone through this difficult time.
McDonald's says its restaurants, deliveries and drive-through services around the country will be closed by midnight tomorrow. Restaurant Brand says all Taco Bell and Carl's Jr. will be closed this evening and is also staggering the closure of KFC and Pizza Hut stores. Domino's Pizza General Manager Cameron Toomey says their delivery services will keep operating.
It is important to note here that it is a very fluid situation along with a lot of things at the moment. We will continue to operate so long as we have the support of our team, our customers and of course the approval of the government. So if either of those were to change, then we would, of course, stop immediately.
Mr. Toomey says Domino's is offering one free meal a week to those over 70 years old, and people can phone to place an order.
In these uncertain times, we all need to pitch together and do our own part. So we definitely recognise that the older citizens are some of the most vulnerable in our society, and we feel that this is our way to provide that service to our community and do our little bit to help everybody out at the moment.
Meal kit delivery company My Foodbag says it's experiencing demand for its services. Its chief executive Kevin Bowler says he's expecting more growth in the coming weeks.
The last couple of weeks for My Foodbag have been the strongest in our history, and we're seeing that I think as a result of people really wanting to access quality food delivered to their door without having to have any interaction with other people.
Mr. Bowler says they've made a long list of small changes to their procedures to ensure the safety of staff and customers.
We're increasing the amount of cleaning. We're providing people with more sanitisation stations and equipment and more cleaning, more separation of people in the assembly areas so that we're working in smaller groups as well.
Unite Union is calling for pizza shops to close out of concerns that it may set an example to every restaurant and undermine the lockdown. The government says businesses can call to confirm whether they are essential services or not. Mutahoraka o te ahiahi nei ko chanleo tēnei.
Let's go to a quick bit of feedback here on the question of whether the warehouse should be able to stay open during the lockdown. This person says it would be farcical to allow the warehouse to continue trading. Grocery is not core business for it. No one regards the warehouse as a supermarket. If they are permitted to open, a lot of other business owners will see a double standard operating, especially small business owners in danger of going to the wall. And if the latter open their doors again en masse, well, good on them, this person says. Don't know about that. Another one says, can you please clarify the number of COVID-19 cases for us? 155 is the number. They started to include suspected cases in the overall total.
RNZ News at 6, ngā mihi nui, ko Susana Leatawa tēnei. The deadline for people needing to travel to get home before the country goes into lockdown has been extended to midnight on Friday. The government has moved the deadline to accommodate the huge number of people trying to get home before the level 4 COVID-19 lockdown starts at 11:59pm on Wednesday. The Minister of Transport, Phil Twyford, says ferry, plane and train services have been inundated. He says they're struggling to meet demand and still leave enough space to implement the level 3 2-metre distance requirements for passengers. Pam Corbett has been at the Blue Bridge Ferry Terminal in Picton all day. The police showed up to direct traffic and had to urge people who didn't have tickets to stay away. Pam Corbett hopes to get a special midnight sailing later tonight.
We feel we just actually have to, hang about and keep meandering up to the terminal, which is crowded with people all standing very close together.
Pam Corbett says the information has been piecemeal and the crowds aren't following the distance rule. The Finance Minister says banks will release details of mortgage repayment holidays for those affected by COVID-19 over the coming days. Retail banks have agreed to a 6-month principal and interest payment holiday for mortgage holders and small and medium-sized businesses. Grant Robertson says those hit by the economic fallout from the virus won't lose their homes.
I know that people will be anxious to know the details. We thought, given that and given the very high level of interest, that it was important we announce this agreement today. But the exact criteria will be defined by banks in the coming days. I ask people not to bombard banks with applications or queries until the banks themselves have released those details.
Grant Robertson says a $6.5 billion finance guarantee scheme for small and medium-sized businesses has also been agreed. The tens of thousands of New Zealanders travelling overseas are being encouraged to consider sheltering in place in light of COVID-19. Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters says there is no guarantee that government-assisted flights will be possible in the extremely complex and rapidly changing global situation. Political reporter Yvette McCullough has more.
The government has been warning for a week that the window for flying home was closing. Mr Peters says now it is almost completely closed. He says those who have the option to return should work with their airlines urgently. But for others, the best option is to prepare to safely stay where they are. Mr Peters says while Mercy flights are being considered, there's no guarantee they'll be able to go ahead. He says consular assistance will be provided where possible. This is Yvette McCullough.
The Prime Minister says shops outside of supermarkets are unlikely to remain open as an essential service. Earlier today, the Warehouse announced it was a provider of key consumer goods and its shops will remain open. But this afternoon, it entered a trading halt as it sought more clarification. Jacinda Ardern has told reporters essential services are things that provide the necessities of life and that maintain the response to COVID-19.
There will be a number of examples that will get thrown at me that will not, in my mind, fit within those circumstances. We have at the moment MB working through some finer details to give exact guidance to individual businesses, including those who consider themselves contactless and who work through order systems, how we'll apply these rules. But don't, for instance, expect to be able to go to your local warehouse.
Jacinda Ardern. The opposition leader Simon Bridges will chair a cross-party committee to scrutinise the government's response to COVID-19. Parliament had technically been in recess this week, but MPs will be recalled tomorrow afternoon to put the country into a state of emergency and establish the lockdown. Leader of the House Chris Hipkins says the epidemic notice from the Prime Minister will be received and an impressed supply bill passed, allowing government funding to continue to flow. To ensure the government is still held to account during the adjournment, a special select committee chaired by the opposition leader Simon Bridges will be formed to interrogate the government on its epidemic response. It's coming up to 4.5 minutes past 6. A large majority of New Zealand athletes are supporting the postponement of this year's Olympic and Paralympic Games in Tokyo. In a joint statement, the athletes, the New Zealand Olympic Committee, Paralympics New Zealand and High Performance Sport New Zealand have confirmed they're backing a delay of the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games because of the coronavirus pandemic. The International Olympic Committee is still officially considering postponing the Games, which are due to start on July 24th. Although IOC member Dick Pound has told USA Today a postponement had already been decided. New Zealand athletes were surveyed, and New Zealand Athlete Commission member Sarah Cowley-Ross says while a small number still wanted to proceed as scheduled, the overwhelming view was for the postponement.
First and foremost, athletes want to put their own health and the health of their families at the forefront, and it was fantastic to see so many athletes come out this morning so swiftly and en masse to give their views.
Sarah Cowley-Ross. The Olympic committees of the US, Canada, Australia and Switzerland are among the countries which have already called for a postponement. That's the news.
This is the latest public health message from the Ministry of Health. The government has announced that effective immediately, New Zealand will be moving to level 3 on the COVID-19 alert system. Physical distancing of 2 metres should be observed when you are outside of your home. The public will continue to have access to essential services such as supermarkets, hospitals and pharmacies when we move to level 4. All educational facilities and early childhood education ECE centres will close, except for a small provision for the children of essential workers. Restrictions will be put in place for travel between regions, apart from people returning to their home or accessing essential services. Additional border measures will be imposed for returning New Zealanders, including the requirement to self-isolate in the city you arrive in. For further information, please visit covid19.govt.nz.
Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight tomorrow. Northland to Taranaki, Coromandel, Waikato, Waitomo and Taumaranui. A few showers easing tomorrow. Bay of Plenty, Taupo, Taihape, Whanganui and Manawatu. Fine apart from isolated evening showers. Horowhenua to Wellington and Gisborne through to Wairarapa. Fine apart from isolated showers in Gisborne and Hawke's Bay until tonight. Bulla and Westland, cloudy periods and isolated showers. For Nelson, Marlborough, Canterbury and North Otago mainly fine. Showers about the western ranges of Nelson and Banks Peninsula. The remainder of Otago, Southland and Fiordland, showers mainly in the south, easing tonight, clearing Otago and inland Southland. Chatham Islands, fine spells, a period of rain tonight and tomorrow morning. RNZ National. It's coming up to 7.5 minutes past 6.
Thanks, Susanna. If you're just tuning in, this is Checkpoint and I'm Lisa Owen. Hunker down and stay home. That's the message from the Prime Minister as the country heads into the final 24 hours before nationwide lockdown begins. It will be 4 weeks minimum before the restrictions lift for New Zealanders. And for those travelling overseas who haven't already got on a plane, it is likely that the window has now closed. For those trying to get home within the country, the government has just announced flights, trains and ferries will keep running until midnight Friday. Here's political reporter Joe Moyer.
The government is continuing to roll out cash to cushion New Zealanders ahead of the lockdown and reassure those who are struggling with bills there will be extra help. Last week, $12.1 billion was announced for businesses and beneficiaries, and over the days since, money has been allocated for individual industries like aviation and Māori health services like whānau ora to boost the people most in need. Today, the Finance Minister Grant Robertson announced a mortgage repayment holiday scheme for homeowners.
Retail banks have agreed to offer a 6-month mortgage repayment holiday to homeowners whose incomes have been affected by COVID-19. This is a similar scheme to that which has been offered in Australia.
The government's also implementing a $6.25 billion scheme for small and medium-sized businesses to protect jobs and support the economy through this unprecedented time.
The scheme will include a limit of $500,000 per loan and would apply to firms with a turnover of between $250,000 and $80 million per annum.
The Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern says she's working on harsher isolation penalties for New Zealanders travelling back from overseas, likely in the form of monitored quarantine. For those who haven't got home yet, the window is likely already shut.
It's one thing, of course, to have Air New Zealand available to make flights. It is another if they have no ability to land in order to make that transit route an option. And that is, and going forward, there will be people who we simply just won't, even through our best efforts, be able to bring home.
The 4-week lockdown will mean forced quality time with loved ones. And for those who are on their own, Jacinda Ardern says there's an exemption, but with conditions.
If you live alone, but you have one person you have contact with, it needs to be just that, a person you stay faithful to and they stay faithful to you in turn.
She says anyone who socialises with people outside their bubble will ruin it for others and almost certainly ensure a longer period of national lockdown. Another exemption being made is for those domestically trying desperately to get home in time for the lockdown at midnight tomorrow. Passengers will now be able to use flights, ferries and trains until midnight on Friday. Those in New Zealand on various temporary work and visitor visas that expire in the next month or so will receive extensions. The government is still furiously working through the specifics of what businesses will be deemed essential services during the lockdown. The Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment's Deputy Chief Executive, Paul Stocks, says if businesses haven't already been told they're essential, then they probably aren't.
We are working through those firms that will be required or allowed to remain open. I would caution firms from leaping to judgments about what their status will be before they have received an adjudication from the government.
The warehouse has been saying it will remain open, but the Prime Minister has crushed that.
But don't, for instance, expect to be able to go to your local warehouse.
With schools closing today, the Secretary of Education, Iona Holstead, says plans are rolling out to make sure as many students have what they need to keep learning at home.
We'll be pleased to connect with teachers interested in working with us. And we're sourcing devices and working through the logistics of getting them to students that need them. We're also working through issues where access to the internet is needed, and while this is a big and complex project, we are making progress.
And she says people working for essential services could bring someone else to look after children at home, as long as that person does not have other contacts other than their own family.
If they identify a trusted buddy, as long as they're not elderly or vulnerable in other ways, and if that person is identified as part of your self-isolated group, they become the child's caregiver. However, it is critical that that buddy cannot then have other contacts other than their own household. You all become one group, but it should be a tight group.
For Parliament, a small group of MPs will meet tomorrow to invoke a state of emergency and pass crucial legislation, and will then adjourn for almost 5 weeks. The National Party leader Simon Bridges will chair a cross-party committee to scrutinise the government's response that will have a majority of opposition MPs.
The parliamentary oversight will ensure that the government improves and lifts its game. I don't say that as a criticism, I simply mean that scrutiny, I think, can make for a stronger overall response for our nation.
Jacinda Ardern is now preparing to hunker down herself, with her own small bubble consisting of her family, a few staff and Grant Robertson.
people cannot expect it to be life as normal, because it won't be for a period of time. And that's so we can keep this period as short as possible. If we're successful, the shorter this period of self-isolation for all of us will be.
From Parliament for Checkpoint, Joe Moyer.
The lockdown deadline has been extended for people trying to hightail it home by 11:59pm tomorrow. Pressure on ferries, trains and planes and the need to keep passengers a safe distance apart means the government's had to rethink things a little bit. Here to explain exactly what the rules are is Transport Minister Phil Twyford. Good evening, Minister. Can you explain...
Good evening, Lisa.
Hi, can you explain to people who are trying to rush home, what is the deal now?
Yeah, so I think everybody knows that the government and the country really has been going flat out yesterday, today and tomorrow to get the country ready for the level 4 lockdown midnight Wednesday. What we found today is that people have been really banking up on both sides of the Cook Strait trying to get home. And when we spoke to Kiwi Rail and to Air New Zealand, it was pretty clear that with all the best will in the world and extra flights put on, that actually those services were not going to be able to get everybody where they need to go on different sides of the Cook Strait, on both sides of the Cook Strait, by the deadline of midnight Wednesday. So we've taken, I think, what is the pragmatic solution here, and we're pushing out the deadline for people who are trying to get home before the cut-off date. We pushed that deadline out now to midnight Friday, and we believe that will ensure there's enough time and enough ferry, train and air services to get people home.
Because obviously there is that complicating factor, isn't there, that the passengers have to be kept a certain distance apart, and that means less capacity.
Yeah, that's right. It's made it harder to move the numbers of people that you normally would move. So Kiwi Rail with the Inter-Islander service have put a limit on the number of people who can travel on those vessels so that people can be spaced out. Air New Zealand are doing the same thing on their flights. So it's just made it harder. And as a result, all kinds of people, including students who have been travelling at one end of the country, desperate to get home to their families at the other end, have been waiting in line, and it's been a pretty stressful and unhappy time today for a bunch of people. So I'm really hoping that this is a fix that will work for everybody.
So how are people behaving out there?
Oh, I think okay, but it's an anxious time for people, and we don't want to create unnecessary stress. And I think this is the kind of practical fix.
And crunching the numbers, are those suppliers like the ferries and the airline, are they pretty confident that that extra bit of time will be enough?
Yeah, they are. We talked that through with them earlier today before I took the proposal to the Cabinet Committee this afternoon, and they advised us that making the deadline now midnight Friday will give them the time to move everybody who needs to.
OK, let's be clear about expectations for everybody else. People who are already at home and businesses, this extension does not apply to them, does it?
No, this is simply people who are travelling to get home or international visitors who are getting to their final destination. That the normal deadline applies to everybody else. And this is simply, and then after the deadline on Friday, non-essential workers, international tourists, that exactly the same rule applies from midnight Friday as applies to everybody else midnight Wednesday.
So 11:59 Wednesday, if you're at home, you need to hunker down.
That's right. Stay at home. Any unnecessary travel should be avoided.
Appreciate your time. That is Transport Minister Phil Twyford there, just confirming for people travelling internally trying to get home, there is an extension to the lockdown to them. They have until midnight on Friday. If you're home, you are locked down from Wednesday at 11:59. If you're a business, you've got to close by then too. The extension is just for people travelling around the island to get to their residence. It is 18 minutes after 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The drought in many parts of the country continues to bite, even after rain in some of the affected areas. The entire North Island, parts of the South Island and the Chatham Islands are in drought. And now under-stress farmers have the double whammy of having to go into lockdown because of COVID-19. Andrew McRae reports.
Parts of Northland and Waikato have had some rain, but not enough to break the back of the extreme dry, and significant rain isn't forecast anytime soon. Neil Bateup from the Rural Support Trust says some areas have started to green up, but it hasn't solved the problem, although he says it's a promising start.
While the paddocks have got a green tinge on them now, there's still no feed, so a lot of supplement feed's still going on at the moment. And I believe quite a number of herds, anecdotally, are drying off now. And I'm in the process of helping dry off a part of my herd.
Neil Bateup says herds are normally dried off in early May. At Northland, there's been sporadic rain, which Julie Juncker from Rural Support describes as a slow creeping response, but still nowhere near the amount required and nowhere near a drought breaker.
Some on the east coast got rain a bit earlier on, so with the follow-up rain, they'll be feeling a little bit more confident. Some of the fronts that came through will have delivered a bit of rain everywhere, but that certainly, it's not enough to make a significant difference, but certainly enough to boost morale a little bit that things are changing.
While grey and overcast in North Canterbury today, there isn't any sign of rain and there hasn't been any for a long time. Winton Daly from the Huranui Adverse Events Committee says most farmers are now resigned to the fact it won't be a good autumn.
I think everybody's hunkering down now for a fairly seriously long winter and just trying to work out their feed supplies and their stocking rates to get through.
Niwa meteorologist Ben Knoll says much of the country has had some rainfall this month, between 40 and 60% of the March average, but not enough to even beat the soil moisture deficit that's built up.
We're seeing anywhere from 20, 30, up to 50 millimetres across the North Island, and that takes another 2 or 3 soaking rainfall events to bring us back to what would be considered normal in terms of soil moisture.
Winton Daly says during a drought, farmers are encouraged to get out, socialise and talk to those facing similar issues. But with the COVID-19 lockdown, that will change.
That's going to be much more difficult for farmers particularly. They'll be much more isolated socially. So we're just really asking them to, I guess, socialise the best they can, social media, and just get on the telephone, have a yarn to the neighbour, have a yarn to family and friends.
He says morale is probably up a bit now the country is starting to realise the primary sector may be the saviour of an economy being ravaged by the virus outbreak. Neil Bateup from Rural Support agrees.
Yeah, ironically it may well be, but farmers, just get on and do their thing and work independently, and they will still continue to do that. And if they can do their part for the country, well, that's tremendous too.
There's no rain on the horizon, according to Ben Knoll from Niwa, until about mid-April. For Checkpoint, ko Andrew McRae Tēnei.
The UK has today announced similar strict lockdown measures as those announced by Jacinda Ardern yesterday. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced gatherings of 2 or more people will be banned. People will only be allowed to leave their homes to buy essential goods, to exercise once a day and to travel to and from work if they cannot work from home. All shops selling non-essential items will be closed, as will libraries, playgrounds, gyms and places of worship. Boris Johnson says it's vital people follow the rules and the police will have the power to enforce them. The BBC's Laura Koonsberg reports from London.
The clock starts on a new phase. Big Ben keeping time on an era none of us could have imagined. Inside, at a desk in Downing Street, an admission to every one of us outside.
Without a huge national effort to halt the growth of this virus, there will come a moment when no health service in the world could possibly cope, because there won't be enough ventilators, enough intensive care beds, enough doctors and nurses. And as we've seen elsewhere in other countries that also have fantastic healthcare systems, that is the moment of real danger. To put it simply, if too many people become seriously unwell at one time, the NHS will be unable to handle it, meaning more people are likely to die, not just from coronavirus, but from other illnesses as well. So it's vital to slow the spread of the disease.
No longer just advice on how to battle the virus, but a demand from Number 10.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home. Because the critical thing we must do to stop the disease spreading between households. That is why people will only be allowed to leave their home for the following very limited purposes. Shopping for basic necessities as infrequently as possible. One form of exercise a day, for example, a run, walk or cycle, alone or with members of your household. Any medical need to provide care or to help a vulnerable person, and travelling to and from work, but only where this is absolutely necessary and cannot be done from home. That's all. These are the only reasons you should leave your home. If you don't follow the rules, the police will have the powers to enforce them, including through fines and dispersing gatherings.
This isn't only an emergency for our hospital wards, but for the country. So all shops must shut unless they sell necessities. All gatherings of more than 2 people banned. The measures will be reviewed in 3 weeks, but...
No Prime Minister wants to enact measures like this. But at present, there are just no easy options. The way ahead is hard, and it is still true that many lives will, sadly, be lost. And yet it is also true that there is a clear way through. In this fight, we can be in no doubt that each and every one of us is directly enlisted. Each and every one of us is now obliged to join together to halt the spread of this disease, to protect our NHS and to save many, many thousands of lives. And I know that as they have in the past, so many times, the people of this country will rise to that challenge and we will come through it stronger than ever. We will beat the coronavirus and we will beat it together. And therefore, I urge you, at this moment of national emergency, to stay at home, protect our NHS and save lives.
Labour had been calling from today for a firmer hand.
We do need to understand how they'll be enforced. We do need to understand the details of who can actually travel to work and who can't travel to work. People are frightened. People are concerned. People just want certainty and clarity. So we welcome what the Prime Minister has said tonight. It's what we were calling for, but we hope the government can quickly follow it up with the details that families tonight deserve to hear.
The demand in every corner of the UK tonight: close the doors.
Let me be blunt. The stringent restrictions on our normal day-to-day lives that I'm about to set out are difficult and they are unprecedented. They amount effectively to what has been described as a lockdown. I know how difficult all of that is, and I am not going to seek to sugarcoat it in any way. But these measures are essential for the protection of all of us.
Our politicians can't hide from the scale of this. Now neither can we. After effort and pain, this will pass, but the country may look different on the other side.
The BBC's political editor Laura Koonsberg with that report. Some relatively good news coming out of Italy. The number of reported cases has fallen for the second day in a row, but it's still Europe's most affected country. Mark Lowen reports.
Tightening the screw on people and the virus. 2 weeks into a nationwide lockdown, the measures are toughening again. Italians now banned from leaving their town and travelling across the country. Not since wartime curfews have these scenes played out.
Well, the limits on movement are being stepped up with ever more police spot checks to see if people can justify why they're out. And yet polls suggest that most Italians would support even tighter restrictions. There is virtually no sense of rebellion or complacency here.
With streets deserted, all non-essential companies will now be shut down too. Italy is running out of things to close. Still open is this laboratory where they're working on a coronavirus vaccine, DNA injections to produce an immune system response. They're aiming for by the end of the year.
We are going to use a genetic vaccination that is a fragment of DNA that is injected into the muscle. We are really confident this technology will work, since we have been using this technology to generate anti-cancer vaccines.
It can't come fast enough for hospitals in the worst-hit region of Lombardy, where all 800 intensive care beds are now taken. 24 doctors have died. Latest figures show a slowdown in new cases, but experts warn caution.
We have to wait more days to evaluate if this decrease continues in the days or is just a good news of a day. But I trust in this containment of a virus.
At one crematorium, the backlog is piling up. Among the companies allowed to stay open are manufacturers of coffins.
And that is the BBC's Mark Lowen reporting from Italy. Just before we go, Paul has written in and he's wanting clarification around the COVID-19 cases. He says yesterday there were 102 cases, today apparently 43, but the total that's being reported is 155. So Paul's asking for clarification. What's been decided today by the Ministry of Health, Paul, is that probable cases will be included in the official count. So those are cases where tests are done and they come back negative, but the clinicians believe that that person did have COVID-19. The test has just taken place too late to pick it up. So all the probable cases are now being counted. There are a total of 13 probable cases and 142 confirmed cases. That brings the overall total to 155. Go and have a look on the Ministry of Health website. There is a running total. You can see all the cases and some general characteristics of the persons who have been infected. Others are getting in touch about the warehouse. Vivian says, as winter approaches, heaters, electric blankets, etc. are essential. The warehouse sells these. Someone else says it's outrageous if they let the warehouse continue to trade. And the Prime Minister says, this person says the Prime Minister needs to stop idiots heading north to their batches. This will spread the virus and put pressure on small communities. We are back again tomorrow.
RNZ News headlines at 6:30. 3 more people from Marist College in the Auckland suburb of Mount Albert have tested positive for COVID-19. Travellers are being given more time to get home ahead of the lockdown, with domestic travel options extended to midnight on Friday. The government and banks have agreed on a $6.2 billion package, which will offer mortgage holders a 6-month payment holiday. And electricity network company Aurora Energy has been fined almost $5 million for power cuts linked to poor maintenance. Those are the headlines. Our next news is at 7.
Tonight on Nights, Eric Crampton still has faith in a post-pandemic free market. Comedian and recovered alcoholic James Nokise talks about his battle to stay off the bottle during those COVID moments. And Trevor Reekie will calm your COVID nerves with the Welsh harp and Senegalese kora of Catherine Finch and